Welcome to session 6A, Shakespeare's Other Witch Plays. My name is Jan Pernis. I am at Campion College at the University of Regina and would like to acknowledge that I am chairing this session from Treaty 4 territory and Métis Nation homeland. But our host institution is located on Treaty 6 territory and the Métis Nation homeland, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. So what the plan here is, we have two speakers, one of whom actually can't be here, but does have a recorded presentation. So I will introduce each speaker, they will have the presentation, and when we've done both, then we can go to questions. It's Sharon who is unable to attend this session, but is at the conference. So she has given me permission to put her email up there in the chat so that if you have questions or comments, you could send them directly to her. Afterwards, though, what we might do for questions is to have the raise hand feature for those who are asking questions of Andrew, or you can ask them and I'll just take a note and pass them on to Sharon. But if you have questions for Sharon, we might choose to use the chat feature. So I think that sounds good. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Andrew Moore is Associate Professor and Director of Great Books at St. Thomas University. He is the author of Shakespeare Between Machiavelli and Hobbes, Dead Body Politics, published by Lexington Books. And he is currently at work on a second book, tentatively titled Magic in Early Modern England, Literature, Politics, and Supernatural Power. Andrew's paper today is entitled The Witch Trial in Othello.
So today I want to talk about witchcraft in Othello, and I want to suggest that Othello begins with a witch trial. My name is Dr. Andrew Moore. I teach in the Great Books program at St. Thomas University. And as I said, here I'm going to talk about witchcraft in Othello. And I plan to do a few things. First, I want to talk about the accusations Brabantio makes against Othello. Then I want to advance a theory about what witch trials accomplish in early modern England. Third, I'm going to talk about something I'm calling explanatory fictions, and talk about the function they have for Othello or in the play Othello, and also the function they might have for us in our lives and in our communities. What I want to suggest is that understanding the function of witch trials might help us understand the logic of contemporary injustice. And particularly, I'm thinking about racism, white supremacy, and a host of other related political problems. Othello is not typically counted among Shakespeare's most magical plays like Midsummer Night's Dream or The Tempest or Macbeth. However, upon inspection, Othello is clearly preoccupied with the supernatural. There's a possibly enchanted handkerchief. There's a stage devil named Iago. One of the main characters in the play is provocatively named Desdemona. So at the very beginning of Othello, after Iago has awakened Brabantio and gotten him riled up with racist and foul language about the beast with two backs and the old black ram, Brabantio goes searching for some motive, some explanation for Desdemona's actions, and he turns to the supernatural. Brabantio suggests that Desdemona has been corrupted by spells and medicines bought at mountebanks. Her willingness to marry Othello against all rules of nature must be attributed to the practices of cunning hell or some dram conjured to manipulate her desires. When Brabantio confronts Othello, he accuses him of using enchantments to seduce his daughter, of binding her in chains of magic. Brabantio apprehends Othello and then brings him before something like a court and has him tried for the use of witchcraft. So I think this moment, this scene, would be immediately recognizable to Shakespeare's audiences as a witch trial. Belief in the efficacy of magic was widespread in early modern England. David Cowla, for instance, has noted that Shakespeare wrote Othello at a time when public anxiety in England over the possible dangers of witchcraft was more than usually intense. There was a popular market for love charms and a popular belief that people could be made to fall in love with others against their will. We might be inclined to think that Brabantio's accusations are based on his sense that Othello is a foreign other. He is from elsewhere, and so he uses magic. But we have to recognize that magic, and particularly the magic that Othello is being accused of using, is not foreign, but rather native to England and Europe. So the key factor in this accusation, I would say, is not necessarily Othello's foreignness, but rather his unnaturalness. Or more precisely, from Brabantio's perspective, Othello's foreign identity has been revealed as an unnatural identity. Kim F. Hall, in her seminal work Things of Darkness, has suggested that categories of race and racism that became so important to the politics and economics of the 19th and 20th centuries and continue into the 21st were under linguistic and conceptual construction in the early modern period. So I think as we work to construct and uncover histories of race and racial representation or racism, I think it's worth attending to the ways that a discourse of the natural and the unnatural are used and mobilized alongside discourses of exoticism and foreignness. So I've made the case that Othello begins with a witch trial. Let's now think about some of the implications of that beginning. What is a witch trial for? What is it supposed to do? What can it accomplish? Witch trials were often triggered by sudden, inexplicable misfortune. A child who is previously healthy is suddenly sick. An adult who is previously healthy suddenly dies. Sometimes witch trials are triggered because someone you love doesn't love you anymore. They love someone else, and you can't explain why. Must be magic. This basic thesis was advanced. It's one of the main premises of Keith Thomas's monumental Religion and the Decline of Magic. And I do have some problems with Thomas's analysis, mostly the concept of decline, but I do think he's mostly correct about this, that inexplicable misfortune, the hardship, associated suffering in human life, gives rise to witchcraft accusations. If we think about the experience of sudden death, of a sudden loss of a person dear to us, a person who seemed to be healthy and suddenly is not. Even in our day-to-day lives, this generates questions about meaning, about causation. How did this happen? Why to this person? Why would God let this happen? My suggestion is that witch trials use legal processes to address existential questions. For example, there's a well-known narrative of the confession of one witch named Elizabeth Stiles, in which she claims to have killed a man merely because he did not loan her a cloak that he promised her. And she killed him merely by touching him on the shoulder. Then he went home and died. What we see, I think, in something like the confession of Elizabeth Stiles is an attempt to understand how this man who seemed healthy went home and died. What happened to him? There's a grasping for explanations. So what I think we're seeing in the early modern witch trial is a substitution of criminal conviction for metaphysical or maybe moral conviction. So criminal conviction serves as a kind of placeholder or stand-in when metaphysical or moral certainty is absent. I think there's a kind of kinship between the sorts of questions that motivate witch trials and the kinds of questions that are plaguing Othello. Precisely because it's difficult to find satisfying answers to these kinds of questions, they inspire us to pursue some other method of achieving certainty and conviction. And as evidence of the kinship between the anxieties that trigger witch trials and the anxieties that motivate Othello, the questions that motivate Othello, those very questions trigger another witch trial late in the play. Laurie Schroeder Haslam has wisely drawn our attention to the way that Othello's interrogation of Desdemona mirrors an early modern witch trial. Othello, too, is tormented by existential, unanswerable questions. How can I be certain that my wife loves me? How do I know that her heart is true? Can I trust my friend? What we see in Othello is a flawed investigative process. And not purely just because Othello is being manipulated and tricked, but also because he pursues a kind of certainty that he is unable to achieve. Iago even tells Othello this. When Othello says he must be satisfied, he must see proof of Desdemona's infidelity, Iago responds, "Where's satisfaction? It is impossible you should see this. Were they as prime as goats, as hot as monkeys, as salt as wolves in pride, and fools as gross as ignorance made drunk?" Now, Iago's point is in part simply pragmatic. It will be practically impossible for Othello to see Desdemona and Cassio in the act. But there is also, I think, a kind of penetrating philosophical insight here. This is something impossible to know. Othello cannot know that Desdemona actually loves him, and less so that she will love him forever, that she will be faithful. We do not know what is going on in the minds of others. Our best friends may be laying traps to betray us. The person who seems to love us most might only be pretending. We cannot, in some final sense, know if our friends or lovers are true. What Shakespeare's Othello demonstrates, I think, is that These problems attendant upon human life, these aspects, this uncertainty associated with the human condition, inclines us towards a certain kind of insecure reasoning. Precisely because we struggle to find satisfying answers for these questions, we seek out explanatory fictions. So now we come to what I want to call explanatory fictions. And in this part of the argument, I'm echoing or trying to follow the lead of Ian Smith, who has argued that Othello represents a major intervention in the emergence of racial discourse. And what I'm humbly trying to do here is to illustrate one of the ways that the play might be making such an intervention, one of the contributions that the play might be making to such a discourse. And what I mean by an explanatory fiction is a false but comforting theory of causation. So for example, to address the sudden, inexplicable death of a child, someone might reach for the explanatory fiction that a malicious witch must have murdered my child. To explain Desdemona's surprising independence when she chooses to marry Othello, Brabantio reaches for the explanatory fiction that Othello must have used magic. So what is it that draws us to explanatory fictions? Allow me to advance a preliminary hypothesis. The explanatory fiction identifies a cause for an event that seems otherwise inexplicable. So explanatory fictions comfort us with the sense that causation can be understood. That alone is comforting. These fictions also seem to shield people from other, more true, but also more painful theories of causation. Consider our witch trial example. The sudden death of a child may prompt a community to believe a malicious, malevolent witch must have caused this death by magic. And on the one hand, that seems like a very disquieting, discomforting thought. But consider how the witch story shields people in the community from other, even more painful accounts of why a child might suddenly die. Perhaps human life is random and meaningless. Perhaps there is an order to the universe, but it is impossible for us to understand it. That's disconcerting. Perhaps God does not exist, or maybe he does, but he will not intervene to prevent human suffering. All of these explanations are arguably more painful and frightening than the idea that there is a witch in the community. So consider how this same structure manifests itself in Othello. Of course, Brabantio grasps for supernatural explanations for Desdemona's behavior, but this may also explain why Othello himself is so easily persuaded by Iago. Does Othello embrace Iago's misogynistic narrative because he can't bear to think himself a fool? Further, what fictions does Iago embrace to explain why he's been passed over for promotion? And disturbingly, of course, this mode of insecure reasoning can also be seen in our contemporary political discourse. We might consider, for example, how certain racist arguments these days mobilize things like IQ studies in order to justify or explain in some comforting way racial inequality and systemic injustice. Shakespeare's Othello prompts us to consider, especially those of us who are white, what kinds of explanatory fictions do white people use to account for our privileged position in society? How do we comfort ourselves with the idea that our position is deserved or earned? And what are the more painful, but also more true explanations for our position that we are unwilling to confront? So that's all for me, everyone. Thank you for watching.